One morning, my wife and I went out for breakfast at a little diner known for its seniors special. 2 eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast, all for just $2.99. A bargain. As we scanned the menu, my wife nodded and said, "That sounds good, but I don't want the eggs." The waitress, a no-nonsense type, shook her head. "Sorry, but if you don't take the eggs, I have to charge you $3.49. That's the a la carte price." My wife blinked. "Wait. You're telling me I have to pay more for not getting the eggs?" "That's right," the waitress confirmed with a straight face. My wife thought for a moment, then smiled sweetly. "Fine, I'll take the special." "Great. How do you want your eggs?" the waitress asked. Without missing a beat, my wife replied, "Raw, in the shell." The waitress looked confused but shrugged and brought the order as requested. My wife carefully placed the 2 eggs in her purse, took them home, and later baked a cake. In a quiet little village, an elderly couple had become something of a local legend. The husband was an astonishing 102 years old, his wife 98, and yet both were in incredible physical shape. They still worked their farm every day, moving with the energy of people half their age. One day, a visitor to the village, intrigued by their story, decided to see for himself. He found the old man chopping wood outside his farmhouse, shirtless, muscles defined, sweat glistening in the morning sun. Amazed, the visitor approached. "Excuse me, sir, but I heard you're 102 years old." The old man wiped his brow and smiled. "That's correct." "I must say, you look absolutely incredible. What's your secret?" The old man chuckled. "Help me carry this wood inside and I'll tell you." Curious, the visitor picked up a few logs and followed him into the house. Once inside, the old man leaned against the table and said, "You see, I've been married for 75 years. When we got married, my wife and I made a little agreement. Every time we have an argument, the loser has to run 5 kilometers. He paused, shaking his head with a smile. "And since we have a pretty normal marriage, well, let's just say I've been running almost every day for 75 years. The visitor laughed. "That explains why you're in such great shape. But what about your wife? She looks just as fit as you." The old man grinned. "Oh, that's easy. She usually runs after me to make sure I finish the whole 5. After retiring, an old widower purchased a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood right across from a high school. For the first few weeks, he enjoyed the peace and tranquility he had longed for. But then, the new school year began. One afternoon, as he sipped his tea on the porch, he heard a racket echoing down the street. 3 young boys were marching past, gleefully banging on every trash bin they passed, turning the neighborhood into their personal drumline. The next day, they did it again, and the day after that, every afternoon like clockwork. After a week of this chaos, the old man decided it was time for action. The following afternoon, as the boys approached, he stepped off his porch and waved them down with a friendly smile. "You kids are a lot of fun," he said. "In fact, I used to do the exact same thing when I was your age. I'd love to hear that sound every day. Tell you what, I'll pay each of you $1 if you promise to come back tomorrow and keep it up." The boys, thrilled at the idea of getting paid to do something they were already doing for free, eagerly agreed. For the next few days, the banging continued, louder than ever. Then, a few days later, the old man came out looking a little downcast. "Fellas," he sighed, "this recession is really hitting my retirement fund hard. I can still pay you, but from now on, it'll have to be 50 cents each." The boys weren't too happy about the pay cut, but 50 cents was still better than nothing, so they continued drumming away on the bins. A few more days passed, and once again, the old man came outside, this time shaking his head in disappointment. "I hate to say this, boys, but times are really tough. From now on, I can only afford to pay you 25 cents each." The leader of the group crossed his arms and scowled. "Are you serious? You expect us to waste our time banging on bins for a measly 25 cents? No way, forget it, we quit." And with that, the boys stormed off. The old man smiled, went back inside, and spent the rest of his days in perfect peace and quiet without spending a single dime. One afternoon, a man was strolling through town when he bumped into an old high school friend, someone he hadn't seen in years. Back in school, this friend had been notorious for bragging, constantly boasting about his wealth, achievements, and relationships. The man wondered if time had changed him. It hadn't. Within minutes, the old friend was rambling on, just as he always had. I've got the most amazing job. You wouldn't believe the salary. My house, a mansion. You should see the view. And oh, I just bought myself a brand new Porsche. Top of the line, of course. The man nodded politely, barely getting a word in as the bragging continued. Then the friend pulled out his wallet and flashed a photo. Here, take a look at my wife. Isn't she gorgeous? The man sighed, exasperated. Then, without missing a beat, he smirked and said, If you think she's gorgeous, you should see my girlfriend. The old friend's eyes lit up. Oh, is she a real stunner, too? No, the man replied with a grin. She's an optometrist. An old football player lay on his deathbed, his breathing shallow, his strength fading. Knowing his time was short, he reached for his wife's hand and whispered, My love, before I go, I need to confess something. I've been unfaithful. Twice throughout our marriage. Please find it in your heart to forgive me. His wife, stroking his hand gently, smiled softly. I forgive you, my dear. But since we are being honest, I too have a confession. I've also cheated. The old footballer blinked. You have? How many times? 3 times, she admitted sweetly. His heart nearly stopped right then and there, not from illness, but from shock. 3? Who were they? He gasped. His wife sighed. Well, do you remember when you struggled to get accepted into the team? No one believed in you and it seemed impossible? He nodded weakly. Well, she continued, I had a little talk with the coach, and after that, suddenly, you were on the team. His eyes widened, but after a moment, he swallowed and nodded. I suppose, in a way, that was for me. All right, who else? His wife hesitated, then said, Do you remember when you first joined and none of your teammates would pass the ball to you? Yes. Well, I may have visited 10 of your teammates and, let's just say, convinced them to be a little friendlier during halftime. The old man choked on his own breath. You did what? She patted his hand reassuringly. It worked, didn't it? He wheezed, struggling to process it all. And the 3rd time? She hesitated again, then smiled sweetly. Do you remember how during matches, no one in town ever cheered for you? The old man's eyes widened in horror as he realized where this was going. And with that, his heart finally gave out. A man lay on his deathbed, his breathing ragged, his strength fading fast. Surrounding him were his weeping wife and their 4 children. 3 of the children were tall, strong, and athletic, the very picture of health and vigor, but the youngest, well, he was small, awkward, and rather unfortunate-looking. With his final moments slipping away, the dying man reached for his wife's hand and whispered, My love, before I go, I need to know the truth. Please, assure me that our youngest child is truly mine. I will forgive you for anything, but I need to hear it from you. His wife gently stroked his forehead and smiled through her tears. Yes, my dearest, she said softly. Absolutely, without a doubt. I swear on my mother's grave, you are his father. The man sighed in relief, a peaceful smile crossing his face. Moments later, he took his final breath. As the room fell silent in mourning, the wife wiped her tears, glanced at her 3 eldest children, and muttered under her breath, Thank God he didn't ask about the other 3. A mother and her teenage daughter, Susie, arrived at the doctor's office, concern etched on the mother's face. The doctor greeted them warmly. All right, what seems to be the problem? The mother sighed. It's my daughter, Susie. She's been having these strange cravings. She's gaining weight and she's sick most mornings. I'm really worried. The doctor nodded, gave Susie a thorough examination, then folded his arms and turned to the mother. Well, I don't know quite how to say this, but Susie is pregnant. About 3 months along, I'd say. The mother's jaw dropped. Pregnant? That's impossible. She's never even been alone with a man. Have you, Susie? Susie shook her head frantically. No, Mom, I swear, I've never even kissed a man. The doctor narrowed his eyes, then slowly walked over to the window and stared outside in silence. A few moments passed. The mother, confused, asked, Doctor, is there something wrong out there? Without turning around, the doctor replied, Not really. It's just that the last time something like this happened, a star appeared in the east, and 3 wise men came over the hill. I'll be darned if I'm going to miss it this time. 3 people passed away on the same day, a doctor, a school teacher, and the CEO of a large insurance company. They arrived at the pearly gates where St. Peter stood waiting. He turned to the doctor first. "Tell me, what did you do on Earth?" The doctor smiled. "I healed the sick, and if my patients couldn't afford to pay, I treated them for free." St. Peter nodded approvingly. "A noble heart. You may enter." Next, he looked at the school teacher. "And you?" "I devoted my life to teaching children who struggled the most, giving them a chance to learn and succeed." St. Peter smiled warmly. "A truly selfless act. You may enter." Finally, he turned to the insurance CEO. "And what about you?" The man stood proudly. "I ran one of the largest insurance companies in the world." St. Peter paused for a moment, then sighed. "Well, you may enter." The man grinned and stepped forward excitedly, only to be stopped by St. Peter's firm voice. "But only for 3 days." A man had 2 sons, Jackson and Blake. From an early age, it was clear that Jackson was sharp as a tack, while Blake had the intellect of a particularly dull spoon. Despite their differences, they were loved equally by their father. One day, their father fell gravely ill and passed away. Jackson, who was away on an important business trip, called Blake with instructions. "Listen, Blake, I can't get there right away. I have an incredibly important meeting, but I'll be on the first flight home. In the meantime, here's my credit card. Make sure Dad gets the best funeral possible. Spare no expense. I want him to look his absolute best." Jackson hesitated for a moment, dreading putting Blake in charge of something so important. But he had no other choice. To his surprise, Blake handled everything beautifully. The funeral was elegant, dignified, and well-organized, and the expenses were surprisingly reasonable. Jackson was relieved. Maybe he had underestimated his brother after all. A few months later, while reviewing his credit card statements, Jackson noticed something odd: a recurring charge of $300 every month. Confused, he called Blake. "Hey, Blake, I don't want to accuse you of anything, but are you still using my credit card? Because I'm seeing a charge for $300 every month." Blake sounded deeply offended. "What? Jackson, I would never steal from you. You know that." Jackson sighed in relief. "Yeah, I do, but then—" "How do you explain these charges?" There was a brief silence on the other end before Blake chuckled. "Oh, that? I bet that's for Dad's tuxedo. You said you wanted him to look his best, so I rented the most expensive suit in town." Margaret was devastated. Her beloved husband Albert had passed away, and she was struggling to come to terms with her loss. She went to the undertaker's office to have one final look at her dearly departed husband. But the moment she laid eyes on him, she burst into fresh tears. A concerned undertaker approached, offering his condolences. "What's wrong, ma'am?" he asked gently. Through her sobs, Margaret explained, "It's just, Albert always wanted to be buried in a blue suit, but he's wearing black." The undertaker nodded sympathetically. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We always dress the deceased in black as a standard practice, but let me see what I can do." The next day, Margaret returned for one final moment with Albert before the funeral. As the undertaker drew back the curtain, her tears turned to a grateful smile. There was Albert, resplendent in a sharp blue suit, looking as dignified as ever. "Oh, this is wonderful," Margaret said, wiping her tears. "But where did you find such a beautiful blue suit?" The undertaker smiled. "Well, yesterday after you left, another gentleman was brought in about your husband's size. Coincidentally, his wife was also very upset, because he was wearing a blue suit, but he had always wanted to be buried in black." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Oh, how fortunate," the undertaker chuckled. "Yes, after that, it was simply a matter of swapping the heads." In a quiet Florida condo clubhouse, 6 retired friends gathered for their weekly high-stakes poker game. As the game heated up, Ron pushed all his chips into the pot, a staggering $5,000. The room fell silent as the final cards were revealed, and Ron lost everything. Before anyone could console him, Ron suddenly clutched his chest, gasped, and collapsed onto the table. Within seconds, he was gone. A heart attack had claimed him mid-game. The remaining 5 players stood in silence, heads bowed, honoring their fallen friend. Then, after a respectful pause, they finished the hand standing up, as any good poker player would. Once the chips were collected, Abraham cleared his throat and asked the group, "So, who's going to tell his wife?" The men exchanged uneasy glances before cutting the cards to decide. Saul won the honor. The group gave him strict instructions. Be discreet, be gentle, and whatever you do, don't make things worse. Saul scoffed. Discreet. Please, discretion is my middle name. Leave it to me. He made his way to the Myers apartment and knocked on the door. Moments later, Ron's wife appeared. Saul, what are you doing here? And where's my good-for-nothing husband? She asked, suspiciously. Saul gulped and straightened his jacket. Well, Ron just lost $5,000 playing poker, and, he's afraid to come home. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then her face turned beet red as she shrieked, What? That idiot lost $5,000! Tell him to drop dead! Saul nodded solemnly. Can do. A tourist in Vienna wandered through an old graveyard, admiring the history carved into the weathered tombstones. As he walked among the graves, a strange sound reached his ears. Music. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as he listened closely, he recognized the tune. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Except it was being played backward. The graveyard was completely empty. No speakers, no musicians, just the eerie sound drifting from beneath the ground. Heart-pounding, the tourist followed the music, tracing it to a particular headstone, Ludwig van Beethoven, 1770 to 1827. Shaken, he rushed out of the cemetery and convinced a friend to come back with him. By the time they returned, the music had changed. Now it was Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, also being played in reverse. Baffled, the men decided to consult a music scholar. The next evening, they brought the expert to the grave. This time, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony was playing backward. The scholar frowned, deep in thought. Wait a minute. The ninth, then the seventh, now the fifth. These are playing in the reverse order of when they were composed. News spread, and soon a crowd had gathered. The next day, the Third Symphony played backward from beneath the soil. Just as the murmurs of speculation grew, the graveyard caretaker arrived, pushing a creaky old wheelbarrow. One of the onlookers turned to him and asked, Do you have any idea what's happening here? The caretaker shrugged and said, I thought it was obvious. He's decomposing. Sharon Lipschitz, a middle-aged woman, was walking down the street one fine afternoon when, bam! A crushing pain seized her chest. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled, and everything went dark. When she came to, she wasn't in a hospital bed. Instead, she was standing next to her own unconscious body on the operating table. Confused, she looked around, then gasped. Standing beside her, cloaked in shadows, was none other than the Angel of Death. That's it? I'm dead? She asked, panic rising in her voice. Not yet, rumbled the Grim Reaper. You've got at least another 20 years. And just like that, poof! He was gone. Suddenly, Sharon's eyes snapped open. She was back in her body. The doctor stood over her, looking stunned. She made it, one of them whispered. After a full recovery, Sharon reflected on her experience. 20 years! She had 20 more years. She wasn't going to waste them, so she did what any woman with a second chance would do. She went all in. While she was still at the hospital, she booked ***, a nose job, a boob job, liposuction, all the works. By the time she was done, she looked 20 years younger. New face, new body, new life. Strutting out of the hospital, radiating confidence, she took a deep breath and smiled. I feel amazing. She took 2 steps into the street. Beep, beep, a speeding ambulance, wham, sent her flying. She stood up, dazed, next to her own lifeless body. Then, like clockwork, the Angel of Death reappeared. Hey, Sharon shouted, furious. You said I had 20 more years. The Grim Reaper squinted at her, tilting his head. Sharon, he asked, leaning in, is that you? I didn't even recognize you. When I was about 7 years old, my father took me to the funeral of one of his co-workers, a man I had never met. Not really understanding the weight of the occasion, I stood off to the side, waiting for time to pass. That's when a bitter-looking man walked up to me. Enjoy life, kid, he muttered. Enjoy it, because time flies. Look at me now. I didn't enjoy it. Then, before I could say a word, he placed his hand on my head and walked away. The interaction was strange, but I was too young to think much of it. A little while later, my father took my hand and led me toward the casket to pay our final respects, and that's when I saw him. Lying inside the coffin, lifeless, was the exact same man who had just spoken to me. My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. My 7-year-old brain couldn't process what was happening. I was traumatized. For years, I had nightmares. I couldn't sleep alone. I saw psychologists, therapists. Nothing could erase that image from my mind. It haunted me well into adulthood. Then one day, I discovered something that changed everything. That bastard had a twin. An old man purchased a well from a clever trickster. The very next day, the trickster stopped the old man on the road and said with a sly grin, "I sold you the well, but not the water in it. If you want to use the water, you'll have to pay me." The old man paused, sizing him up, then calmly replied, "Actually, I was just about to visit you to ask when you plan to remove your water. You see, if you leave it there, I'll have to start charging you rent for using my well as storage. Sometimes trying to outsmart someone can backfire spectacularly." Betsy and Dan had been married for 25 long years, and anyone who knew them knew they couldn't stand each other. They fought about everything: what to eat, where to go, even the weather. Then, in their 26th year of marriage, Dan had a heart attack and died. A few days later, Betsy walked into the local newspaper office to place an obituary. "We offer 4 lines up to 80 words for $100, the ad editor told her. "That's too expensive," Betsy grumbled. "He didn't do much anyway. What else you got?" The editor hesitated, but then offered 3 lines, 25 words for $35. "Still too much." Desperate to get this over with, the editor sighed and said, "Fine, 2 lines, 5 words, $5. That's the cheapest we can do." Betsy nodded and handed over the cash. "All right, what would you like the obituary to say?" the editor asked. Betsy thought for a moment before saying, "Dan's dead. Car for sale." 3 retired gentlemen were sitting together over coffee, reminiscing about their most exciting experiences. The first, a retired sheriff, leaned back and said, "Back in my younger days, I was in a shootout with Bonnie and Clyde." The other 2 whistled in admiration. "Now that's exciting." The second, a retired fireman, grinned. "I once battled a massive fire at the university. Flames everywhere, fire trucks from miles around, and best part, dozens of damsels in distress to rescue." The others nodded. "Now that's what you call thrilling." Then it was the third man's turn. A retired undertaker, he took a deep breath and said, "One night I got a call from the Hilton to pick up a body. No problem. I get there, the room's quiet, and the body's under a sheet. So far, so good." The other 2 leaned in. "But then I lifted the sheet, and the guy had a huge, well, bulge, if you know what I mean. I thought, there's no way I can wheel him through the lobby like that. So I grabbed a broom and gave that bulge one good whack to settle things down." He paused, shaking his head. The fireman frowned. "Wait, I'm not seeing the excitement here." The undertaker sighed. "Turns out, I was in the wrong room." A guy walks into a travel agency and books a 2-week cruise for himself and his girlfriend. A couple of days later, the travel agent calls him and says, "Sorry, the cruise has been canceled, but I can get you on a 3-day cruise instead." The guy shrugs. "All right, that'll do." He heads to the pharmacy and buys 3 Dramamine and 3 condoms. The next day, the travel agent calls again. "Good news, I can now book you on a 5-day cruise instead." The guy nods. "Even better." He goes back to the same pharmacy and buys 2 more Dramamine and 2 more condoms. The day after that, the agent calls once more. "You're in luck. An 8-day cruise just opened up." The guy, thrilled, agrees and rushes back to the pharmacy. "Hey, I'll take 3 more Dramamine and 3 more condoms," he says. This time, the pharmacist raises an eyebrow and finally asks, "Look, buddy, if it makes you that sick, why do you keep doing it?" A man goes in for an interview for a job as a TV news broadcaster. The interview goes well. He's articulate, confident, and has a great voice. There's just one problem. He won't stop winking at the camera. The interviewer finally says, "Listen, you have a lot of the qualities we're looking for, but this constant winking, that's a real problem. I'm afraid we can't hire you unless you can get it under control." "Oh, that's no problem at all," the man says. "If I take a couple of aspirin, the winking stops for a few hours, more than enough time to do a broadcast." "All right," says the interviewer, "show me." So the man reaches into his right pocket, but as he pulls his hand out, it's full of condoms, every variety, every size, every color. The interviewer raises an eyebrow. Flustered, the man digs into his left pocket. Again, more condoms spill out. Finally, after some fumbling, he finds the aspirin. He takes a couple, and sure enough, the winking stops. The interviewer is amazed. Wow, that's incredible. I'd hire you on the spot. Except, we don't make a habit of hiring womanizers. We've had too many harassment suits. Excuse me, the man exclaims. I'm a happily married man, not a womanizer. Well, how do you explain all the condoms then? The man sighs. Have you ever tried going into a pharmacy asking for aspirin while winking the whole time? As Josh strolled down the street, he spotted his buddy Michael hurrying along, his arms overloaded with shopping bags. Michael's eyes darted around nervously, and he seemed a little on edge. Hey, Michael, is everything all right? You look kinda jumpy. Michael let out a deep breath and set his bags down for a moment. Yeah, I just came from that new state-of-the-art supermarket they opened in the industrial district. Josh's eyes lit up. Oh, I heard it's incredible. What's it like? Michael hesitated for a moment, then launched into a detailed, animated description. He raved about the store's cutting-edge approach to shopping. It was all about naturalness and authenticity. In the dairy section, you don't just see milk bottles on shelves. You hear cows mooing and smell the barn. The egg aisle? Chickens clucking all around with a whole coop suspended from the ceiling. And don't even get me started on the produce section. You can literally hear farmers chatting in the fields and smell the fresh soil. Josh was amazed. That sounds incredible. Like a completely immersive shopping experience. Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. Yeah, in principle. Josh frowned. Wait, in principle, what's wrong with it? Michael grimaced and picked up his bags again. Let's just say, this is the last time I'm buying toilet paper from there. Fresh out of seminary school, Father Josh was eager to fulfill his calling. His first official duty as a parish priest had arrived. A funeral for a homeless man who had no family or friends. Though the deceased had lived a lonely life, Father Josh was determined to give him the loving farewell he likely never received in life. The funeral was set to take place at a brand new cemetery on the far side of town. Unfamiliar with the area, Josh took a few wrong turns and arrived later than expected. As he pulled up, he was relieved to see a small group of workers gathered around an open grave. Without hesitation, he grabbed his Bible and rushed over, his heart swelling with purpose. He delivered a stirring eulogy, pouring his soul into every word. His voice resonated with deep emotion as he prayed for the departed soul, offering words of comfort and redemption. The workers stood silently, heads bowed, tears welling in their eyes. As he finished the service, Father Josh made the sign of the cross, wiped his own misty eyes, and turned to leave. He nodded gratefully to the workers for their silent respect and walked back to his car, feeling a sense of fulfillment. Just as he was about to open the car door, he overheard one worker whisper to another, I've never seen anything like that before, and I've been installing septic tanks for over 20 years. The young eaglets were preparing to leave the nest and soar into the world when their grandfather stopped by. He perched on the edge of the nest, proud and majestic, to offer them wisdom and well wishes. Curious about the world beyond, one eaglet asked, Grandfather, what's your favorite thing to eat? The old eagle thought for a moment. That'd have to be salmon or maybe trout. Oh, one day soon, you'll find out. A granddaughter tilted her head. What do you usually eat? Rabbits are always a good catch. And squirrels, you've seen those, right? Sure. We see them running around the branches all the time, she chirped excitedly. Well, keep an eye out. Those are tasty. An eagle eye, a cheeky grandson quipped. He was immediately smacked. What about birds? The granddaughter continued. Do we eat those? Some, yes, the grandfather nodded. Seagulls, for example. Easy to catch, decent meal. Another grandson spoke up. There's a big white bird with long legs that lives by rivers and streams. Do you eat those? The wise old eagle nodded. Ah, you mean egrets? Yes, have you eaten many of those? The old eagle stared off into the distance, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Egrets. I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. Once a year, in a quiet little village known for its politeness and piety, the people would set aside their virtues for a single day to partake in a most unusual tradition, a competition of curses. On this day, the village square would fill with eager spectators as one by one, contestants stepped onto the dais to unleash their most creative, vile, and shocking profanities. But this year, the competition was lackluster. While some villagers had come up with clever insults and foul-mouthed rants, nothing truly groundbreaking had been uttered. The crowd had heard it all before. As the afternoon waned, hope for a truly memorable performance dwindled. That was when someone called up Peter, a man known for the occasional colorful outburst but hardly a master of the craft. They called his name once. No answer. Twice. Still nothing. Just as they were about to move on, the door to the village outhouse suddenly slammed open. Peter came sprinting toward the stage, eyes wide, face flushed, still fastening his belt, and before he even reached the dais, he let loose. A torrential downpour of curses erupted from his mouth, an awe-inspiring verbal storm so foul, so blisteringly creative, that even the most seasoned elders gasped. Words so profane they defied linguistic decency, insults so venomous they could curdle milk. The sheer intensity of his tirade sent a hush through the crowd, as villagers instinctively took a step back, as if the words themselves carried a physical force. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Peter's furious outburst slowed, then ceased altogether. Silence hung in the square. The villagers stood in stunned amazement. Peter wiped his brow, let out a deep breath, and beamed. "All right," he said cheerfully. "Got that darn zipper up, now for the cursing."